Yo, Kpaceguy here. What's going on YouTube? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to what I think is going to be a really interesting topic for the majority of you guys out there. So lately in the comment section down below, you guys have asked me, are AV receivers, the way to go, or should I get a component, maybe an AV processor, or should I get an extra amplifier or two? And so we're going to debunk that because I've had a lot of different AV receivers. Pioneer, Yamaha, Marantz, haven't had Denon, I had Onkyo, I've had even a cheap RCA Walmart brand before. And then now I have a Marantz processor. This is my first ever processor. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys what I think. Are separates better? Are separates, do they sound better? I'm going to let you guys know that right here, right now. So if you're unfamiliar with my home theater, I currently run a Marantz 7705 preprocessor, and then I have a Monoprice Monolith 7 power amplifier giving 200 watts to all of my speakers in my home theater. And it's been night and day difference for me, more so the Monolith than the AV processor. But I absolutely will not go back to an AV receiver, and here's why. So to break down what the difference is first, an AV receiver is your central hub where all the connections are made. Speakers are connected to it, all your video inputs, any extra audio sources that you have, it all goes to one central hub. And that's really nice. It keeps things nice and tidy. You have everything controlled with one remote in a sense and all that good stuff, right? Now an AV processor is exactly the same as a AV receiver, except it doesn't have internal amplification. It relies on extra amplification outside the chassis. So an AV receiver, they're usually a little more heavier than an AV processor, usually. Really good processors are a little bit heavy too, like a Marantz 7705, but usually the AV receivers are a little more heavy because they have actual amplifiers inside that will power your speakers. Now the reason why I went to a processor is because I don't use any of the amplification inside my receiver. Why do I not? Because AV receivers don't really give the best power, especially at higher volumes, or the more channels you have, meaning the more speakers you're running, the less power you're going to be getting from the speakers because it has to divide it between all the speakers you have. So for me, I have a extra amplifier or two. I have the Emotiva Bass X A300, that is a 2-channel amplifier powering 2 of my Atmos speakers, and then I have the Monoprice Monolith 7, which is powering everything else. And the reason why I don't have an AV receiver anymore is because I'm not using the amplification inside of it. It doesn't give me enough power. And usually the more power, or the closer to rated that you power your speakers, the more performance you'll get out of them. So there really isn't much difference between an AV receiver and a preprocessor, other than that the AV processor does not have any internal amplification. It relies on an outside source. Now, the number one question that I get from you guys is not necessarily should I go preprocessor or AV receiver, it's does a preprocessor sound better than an AV receiver? Now, let me tell you guys a little secret that you guys probably already know, maybe some are new. But an AV receiver is also a processor if you get a high-end AV receiver. On the back, you may see some outputs that say subwoofer or front left, front right, height, whatever the case is. On the back of your receiver, you may see some what we call pre-outs. And that allows you to hook up your AV receiver to external amplification. So an AV receiver is a processor, but a processor is not an AV receiver. A square is a rectangle is not a square. Kind of the same concept there, right? So on the back side of your AV receiver, you're able to plug in extra amps so that you can power your speakers with more sufficient and more power, right? So an AV processor allows you to do the same thing without the amplification inside of it, but it costs you more. Now, all that information we now know about AV processors and AV receivers. Do AV processors sound better than AV receivers? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say no. Let me start off with the no. Like I said, AV processors and AV receivers kind of do the same thing, other than the lack of amplification inside the processor. But if you plug in an amplifier to your AV receiver, it's going to sound just like an AV processor. It's just processing your information for you. Now, the reason why I say yes, they sound better than a AV receiver is because you have to have extra amplification with an AV processor, and you don't have to have that with an AV processor, or excuse me, with an AV receiver. So AV receiver amplification is never going to really beat a dedicated amp. It's just not going to beat it. AV receivers inflate their rating. So on the front of your receiver, you may see 240 watts times 7 or 180 watts times 7. That's not true. It's usually rated at 2 channels, and that may even be exaggerated as well. So you're not getting true rated power out of that receiver like you think you are. Most speakers nowadays are between 50 to 150 watts, maybe 10 to 100 watts. So usually AV receivers can power most speakers, but when it gets to speakers that are like 8 ohms, 6 ohms, 4 ohms, or if you have a speaker that has a lot of power handling, you're really missing in performance when you're using just amplification from your receiver. That's when the preprocessors come in, because you have to have extra amplification, and those usually, if not always, sound better than what an AV receiver can give you. When I switched from my Yamaha receiver to a Marantz preprocessor and then put a monolith power amplifier on it, my sound changed dramatically. I had a lot more detail on the high end, I had a lot more power handling, I could turn it up a little bit louder without distortion, and it really just brought everything to life. I rewatched old movies and they sounded new again, or maybe refurbished, I would say. They just sounded so much better. My whole viewing and listening experience just changed for me, and for the better. And that's because I gave my speakers the right kind of power, the true power that they need. AV receivers, again, can power most speakers, and they do them pretty well, but when you start to really crank those AV receivers up is when you start seeing the weakness in their power. And that's what an AV processor is really for. It's just to get rid of the whole amplification that it has inside and give you something more dedicated for the task. So, do I think they sound better? Yes, because you have to use amplification, but do I think they sound better? No, because depending on if you're using the amplifiers inside your AV receiver, you may or may not see a difference. So, guys, leave me a comment down below. Let me know in your home theater right now, are you using an AV receiver or are you using extra amplification from a preprocessor? Or are you using an AV receiver and extra amplification? Let me know that down below in the comments below. Hit that like button while you're at it, and if you're not subscribed already, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you in the next video. Kpaceguy out. Peace.